डॉक्टर बाबासाहेब आंबेडकर ओपन युनिव्हर्सिटी.
Namaskar friends, welcome to Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University's video 8 sessions. I, Dr. Nikita Kadani, Assistant Professor in Department of English, School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University. Today's our topic is Paper 2, Introduction to English Language and Structure, Unit 2, Language as a Product of Society and Culture. So now moving ahead to the components of presentations are that the components of presentations, then we have objectives, we have a language and society, we have a language and culture, language as a product of society and culture, then we have questions, and then we have references. So moving ahead with the objectives of our topic, that is to discuss how society, culture and language are related, and to discuss society and culture help in the evolution of language. So introduction of our topic is that have you ever asked yourself how we got here? I mean, from the Stone Age to this present civilized state. What have been the major defining factors that have led us here, that is intelligence and the faculty of language, or rather the capability to use language. It is one primary reason that the cavemen started to interact, live together, develop and grow. Human language is a unique among the communication system of the natural world. It is socially learned and offers open-ended communicative potential. It is a complex and fascinating phenomena that has played a role in recording human thoughts, explorations and achievements. It is a primary tool of thought and precision. Language not only reflects and expresses facts and observation, it also influences attitudes and behavior. Languages are constantly changing, sometimes into entirely new variety of speech, leading to subtle difference in how we present ourselves to others. However, the question is that how is the language, culture and society interrelated? To do, let us first examine how they are connected. Cut, थोड़ी स्पीड हो कम कर जो ना. अभिषेक भाई थोड़ी स्पीड कम कर. अच्छा ओके. हाँ बस आप बराबर से. So the moving ahead, the language and society. Language is central to the social interaction in every society regardless of location and time and the period. Language and social interactions have a reciprocal relationship. Language shapes social interactions and the social interactions shape language. Sociolinguistic is the study of the connection between language and society and the way people use language in different social situations. People adjust the way they talk to their social situation. An individual, for instance, will speak differently to a child than he or she will to their college professor. This social situation variations is sometimes called register and depends only on the occasions and the relationship between the participants, but also not the participants' region, ethnicity, socio-economic and status and age and the gender also plays the vital role. There are several possible relationships between the language and society. One is that social structure may either influence or determine linguistic structure or behavior. The variety of language that speakers use reflect such matters as their regional, social or ethnic origin and possibly even their gender, and other studies which shows that the particular ways of speaking, choices of words and even rules of conversing are in effect highly determined by certain social requirements. The other possible relationship is that the influence is bidirectional. Language and society may influence each other. So we have language, varieties and dialects. Hudson defines a variety of language as a set of linguistic items with similar distribution. A definition that allows us to say that all of the following are varieties, that is the Canadian English, the London English, the English of commentaries and so on. So according to him, this definition also allows us to treat all the languages of the same multilingual speakers or the community as a single. Variety, since all the linguistic items concerned have a similar social distribution. A variety can therefore be something greater than a single language as well as something less even than something traditionally referred as a dialect. So, talking about the language and dialect, that for many people there can be no confusion at all about the language they speak. Most speakers can give a name to whatever they speak. On occasion, some of these names may appear to be strange to those who take scientific interest in the language, but we should remember that language naming practices often have a large unscientific component to them. Census takers in India find themselves confronted with a wide range of language names when they ask people what language or languages they speak. The names are not only recognized by region, which is what we might expect, but sometimes also by the caste, the religion, the region, the village and so on. So moreover, they can change from census to the census as the political and the social climate of the country changes. For example, the same word on non-verbal communications in India differs from the place to place. The word Dada in Gujarat means the grandfather, but the same does not exist or does not have the similar quality in East India. While people do usually know what language they speak, they may not always claim to be fully qualified speakers of what they speak. They may experience difficulty in deciding what they speak should be called a language proper or merely a dialect of some language. Various Gujarati dialects and other regional dialects are part of society they live in. So now we see that how language influences the people. Language is so powerful that it actually affects how you see the world. It also influences the way we think and behave. And a linguist called Fof claimed language actually affects the way you see the world. So language is like a pair of glasses through which we see everything. Still, some like to believe that the language we use will affect the way we think about something. In 1976, the British government replaced the official Secret Acts with the Official Information Act. So the name had gone from secret to information, but the laws were unchanged. After the Second World War, the Britain's Ministry of War became the Ministry of Defence. It is also worth noting that a defence contract is still an arms deal by another name. So language doesn't affect what we can see in the world, but it is still possible that language affects people and society, because maybe language still affect that the way we think. Social context will look at the relationship between the language and power and attitude to the language. The language that someone uses may influence other people's attitudes towards them. People have fought and died for the languages, in some countries in the world, you can arrested for speaking a forbidden languages. So, thus language is inseparable part of society, and they both nurture and they both feed each other. So, now moving ahead with this language and culture, that culture is not determined by a person's native language or nationality. It is true that languages vary by country and region, and that the language we speak influences our realities. But even people who speak the same language experience cultural differences because of their various interesting cultural identities and the personal experiences. We have a tendency to view our language as a whole more favorably than other language. Although people may make persuasive argument regarding which languages are more pleasing to the ears or difficult or easy to learn than the others, no one language enables speakers to communicate more effectively than another. From birth we socialize our society into a various cultural identities. As we the social context, this acculturation process is a combination of explicit and implicit lessons. Just as babies acquire knowledge of language practices at an astonishing rate in their first 2 years of life, so do they acquire cultural knowledge and values that are embedded in those language practices. At 9 months old, it is possible to distinguish babies based on their languages. Even at the early stage of development, when most babies are bubbling and they are just learning to recognize but not wholly reproduce verbal interactions pattern, a Gujarati baby would sound different from a Marathi baby, even though neither would actually be using words from the language of Gujarati and Marathi. So, the actual language we speak plays an important role in shaping our realities. Comparing language, we can see differences in how we see and how we able to talk about the world. In English, we have the words grandfather and grandmother, but no single word that distinguishes between a maternal grandfather and a paternal grandfather. But in Gujarati, what we have, that is a dada for paternal grandfather and nana for maternal grandfather. So, in this example, we can see that the words available to us based on the language we speak, based on the culture we live. The notion that language shapes our view of reality and our cultural patterns is best represented by the Spear and Wolf hypothesis. Although some scholars argue that our reality is determined by our language, we will take a more qualified view and presume that language plays a central role in influencing our realities but doesn't determine them. Culturally influenced differences in language and meaning can lead to some interesting encounters, ranging from awkward to informative. In terms of awkwardness, you have likely heard the stories of companies that fail to exhibit communication competence in their naming or advertising of the products in another language. For example, in Taiwan, Pepsi used the slogan, "Come alive with Pepsi," only to later find out that when translated it means that Pepsi brings your ancestors back from the death, a result of poor cross-cultural awkwardness. So, at a more informative level, the words we use to give positive reinforcement are culturally relative. In the United States and in England, parents commonly and positively and negatively reinforce their child's behavior by saying that a good girl or a good boy. So there isn't any equivalent for such a phrase in other European languages. So the usage is only these two countries has been traced back to the Puritan influences on the beliefs about the good and the bad behavior. In terms of another way, one of the most publicized and the deadliest cross-cultural business mistakes occurred in India in 1984. Union Caribbean, an American company, controlled a plant used to make pesticides. The company underestimated the amount of cross-cultural training that would be needed to allow the local workers, many of whom were not familiar with the technology or the languages or the jargon used in the instructions for the plant operations and to do their jobs. So this lack of complete communications lead to a gas leak that immediately killed more than 2,000 people and over a time led to more than 500,000 injuries. So in general, culture is headed down through the generation by communication, teaching and imitation. It is considered as a social heritage of the organized group. It can be said to be a pattern of responses, that is the thinking, feeling and behaving developed by the society for dealing with issues arises due to the interactions and interpretations of the group members and the environment. So moving ahead, that how language is a product of society and culture. Society and language are correlative terms. It is hard to think of ourselves, our society and our culture without language. Culture unifies a community, although there is the unity. As we evolved, the need for language and the communications became clear. It becomes almost like a natural need. Communication is necessary and vital to man, just like the intake of water and the food is essential for the survival of mankind. Language is a primary means of socialization. Language is a social product springing up with the first community, developing with the increasing needs of culture and civilization. It has been observed that there is no community or a society, language also disappears. Thus, language happens to be the index of the progress of society. The longer a society exists, the richer is the language. Therefore, we can say that the society and languages are mutually indispensable. The phrase language is culture and the culture is a language is often mentioned when language and culture are discussed. From the earliest times, language can have developed only in a social setting and culture started when speech was available. Language itself is a mirror of society and culture. The values can be reflected in the language. Language in society is constantly evolving and is a subject to growth and change in a much the same we have as a living organization. It is different to think of a society without a language, which is the foundation of the human progress. Just as the culture and societies are dynamic, so are languages. Language grows and continuously adapts, evolving. We came up with the better words that reflects our society or our culture. In particular time, it mirrors the complexity with which our lives are. As with the technology, we strive to optimize language so we can communicate complex ideas with most clarity in the most effective way. So there is no doubt that the amount of technical vocabulary we use in everyday life is currently growing faster than even before. With roughly half of the world's populations now connected to the internet, and we see that massively increased levels of communication. ideas, words and phrases are being generated and circulated at an amazing rate. So, to recapitulate, we can say that languages, even if it was the most primitive or rudimentary, must have played a key role in bringing people together into a community, leading to the formation of society and help to develop a common culture. Language not only reflects and expresses the facts and observation, it also influences attitudes and behavior. Therefore, we can say that the social changes produce changes in language, and the language is indeed a product of society and culture. So now the questions are given over here, that for example, is a growth of culture possible without language? Why? So can you imagine that you are in a society where you do not have a language? So without language, would you be able to communicate? So as we see that, like in the ancient times, people used to communicate with certain symbols and that certain script. But now in the present time, do you imagine and can you imagine your society without language? So this you have to mention in your first questions. Now the second question is that, is it possible that within a culture many societies can exist? So if we talk about India, we have more than 27 to 28 states, and that each state has its own culture. For example, in Gujarat, we have a Gujarati culture, we follow our certain traditions, we follow our certain patterns of communication, we follow our certain rituals. While in Maharashtra, we have certain different patterns to be followed. So, is it possible that within a culture many societies can exist? So, can you imagine that that for example, when you go to Maharashtra and you try to follow all your rituals, except that Marathi culture, so somehow we try to manage, but then it is only a group of people who are managing, they cannot establish a particular society. So this you have to mention over here. Then we have that, do you think the language spoken today will remain the same in future, and why? So the most difficult question is that when we see that nowadays in technological era, the languages are changing in a very rapid way. So for example, that we initially we had text messaging, and now we have upgradations that we have a WhatsApp, we have a Twitter, we have a Facebook. So there we are using that emojis which conveys our emotions. For example, if we are not in a good mood, then what we do, that we use a particular emojis. If we are so happy, then also we use that the smiling face. So do you really think that the language will remain the same as it is in present time? No, it will not remain the same. Why? Because it keeps on changing, and the evolution of language, it keeps on changing. So there may be few words, there may be few emojis, there may be few things will be added every day, and this will be also acceptable by the society. Then we have the languages used by the person reflect his or her cultural background. Comment on this. Yes. Do you really think that the language we use that represent our culture? Yes, it is true. Why? Because when we talk about our culture, for example, then in Gujarat we have a certain dialects and certain accents. So for example, when a North Gujarati people would talk and the South Gujarati people would talk, so there would be different. Why? So the language would be the same, but for example, the accent would be different. So why there is a different accent? Because of their cultural importance, and due to their culture they have this certain different accent, and which is reflected in that language. And for example, when even Marathi people, they try to talk to Hindi or they try to talk to Gujarati, that is also different. Why? Because they are trying to adapt the pronunciations, they are trying to adapt the language, and that is why it is not the same. And that is also the thing, that language used by person reflect his or her culture. So how? Because we have grown up in a particular way, in a particular society, in a particular culture, and our language is shaped in the basis of all these categories. And when we try to speak something, when we try to present something, it is completely, it reflects our culture. As previously we have seen the example of that Pepsi. So they do not have any idea that what this particular word has a culturally different meaning in particular region. So for example, that is namaste, that is what we have, that is a different, that is to respect something. But maybe in other region of the world, in other country, the namaste would be a different meaning. So this represent our language, our gesture also represent our culture. So here we have a references. You can read more on this, you can use these references, and to expand your reading and to get more information, you can use these resources and web resources. So I hope you have got the knowledge about how language, societies and culture are interrelated, and without one we cannot imagine any of the thing. So without language we cannot imagine our culture and society. Without culture we cannot imagine the evolution of language, and without language we would not have a particular society and a particular culture. Thank you. See you in next session.